The kitchen light hummed like a tired insect. Outside, the street was a ribbon of distant headlights and the occasional bark of a dog. Ordinary noises that made the house feel smaller, more intimate, as if the world had folded itself away to leave only the two of us. I had the wedding invitation in my hand, the paper still warm from the printer, the gold script catching the light like a promise. I had imagined this night 1,000 times. The way my son would stand at the threshold of a new life. The way relatives would clap and cry. The way my chest would swell with a pride that could drown out anything else. He closed the door behind him without a sound and sat across from me at the table. He did not smile. He did not fidget. He folded his hands as if he were holding something fragile and said, "Please don't come." The words landed like a stone. For a moment, I thought he was joking, some awkward attempt at modesty, a son trying to spare his father the embarrassment of being the center of attention. But his eyes were steady, and there was a tremor in his voice that had nothing to do with nerves. It was the tremor of someone who had rehearsed courage until it felt like a habit. "What?" I asked, though I already felt the answer curling up from the back of my throat. Shame has a way of announcing itself before the facts do. He told me about the whispers, about the cousin who had a talent for turning small things into verdicts, about the aunt who kept a ledger of every misstep and read it aloud at family gatherings. He spoke of a story that had been told and retold until it hardened into truth, a version of my past that painted me as reckless, as the kind of man who made mistakes and never paid for them. He said the bride's family had been fed that version, that they had been warned, that the wedding would become a stage for old gossip. I felt the old shame rise like bile. I had made mistakes, one big mistake that had cost me more than I could ever repay. I had thought I had paid for it in private, that the ledger had been closed. But the family had never let it go. They had turned it into a story, and stories have a way of outliving the people who tell them. "You think they'll make it about you?" I asked. He nodded. "They'll make it about you. They'll make it about us. They'll ask questions. They'll look at her, and then at me, and then at you, and they'll decide what kind of man I'm based on a rumor." There was a silence that tasted like metal. I could hear the refrigerator cycle, the soft scrape of a chair in the next room. I thought of the invitations, the guests, the flowers. I thought of the way my mother used to say that weddings are for the living to forgive the dead. I thought of the way my father had stood at my own wedding and smiled through a grief he never spoke of. "Then don't go," I said, because it felt like the only answer that made sense. I imagined staying home, watching from the window as my son walked into a room full of people who had already decided his fate. I imagined shame being contained, kept like a bad smell outside the door. He shook his head. "It's not about hiding. It's not about cowardice." He leaned forward, and the light caught the line of his jaw. "I've been thinking about this for months. I found something, letters, photographs, things no one was meant to see. The story they tell about us is not the whole story." He told me about the box he had found in the attic, a box I had forgotten existed. He told me about a confession written in a hand I recognized, about a promise I had made and kept in silence. He said the version of events everyone believed had been shaped by someone who had wanted to protect themselves, and in doing so had handed our family a lie that had become a weapon. My throat tightened. I had carried that secret like a stone in my pocket. I had thought silence was the only way to keep the peace, to keep someone else safe. I had not imagined that silence could be used as proof of guilt. Halfway through his explanation, he paused, and for a moment the kitchen felt like a theater waiting for the next act. He looked at me with a steadiness that was almost frightening. "I'm not asking you to stay away because I'm ashamed of you," he said. "I'm asking you to stay away because I need you to trust me. Where are you watching from?" The question slipped out of him then, soft and strange, as if he were speaking to an audience beyond the walls. It was the kind of engagement that felt like a dare, an invitation to witness, to choose a side. I realized then that he was not asking me to be absent. He was asking me to be part of something larger, something dangerous. He had a plan. He would not walk into the wedding as the obedient son who accepted the verdict. He would arrive later with the letters, with witnesses, with the person who had been silenced for decades. He wanted to expose the lie at the moment it would hurt the most, when the family was gathered, when the cameras and phones would capture every reaction. He wanted to force the truth into the open so it could no longer be traded in whispers. "You'll ruin everything," I said, because fear is a language I know well. He smiled, but it was not a happy smile. It was the smile of someone who had decided that some things are worth destroying. "Maybe," he said, "maybe we need to ruin what's rotten to save what's left." The next days were a study in restraint. He moved through the house like a man carrying a secret that could combust at any moment. He rehearsed his words in the mirror, folded the letters into envelopes, and called people he hadn't spoken to in years. I watched him from the doorway, from the kitchen, from the small places where a father watches a son become someone he barely recognizes. On the night of the wedding, the house smelled of jasmine and frying oil, the same scent that had filled our home on every celebration. I sat in the living room with the invitation on my lap, the gold script catching the lamplight. I had imagined standing at the back of the hall, clapping when my son took his vows. Instead, I sat, listening to the distant music and the muffled laughter that sounded like a foreign language. Hours passed. The clock on the mantel moved with a slow, indifferent hand. I thought of the faces that would be there. The cousin who loved a good story, the aunt who kept score, the bride's family who had been warned. I thought of the moment when the truth might be revealed and the way it would land like a stone in a still pond. When the door finally opened, it was not the sound I expected. He did not come in with the swagger of a man who had one. He came in like someone who had been to the edge of something and stepped back. He carried a small box under his arm, the kind of box that holds letters and old photographs and the weight of a life. He set the box on the table and looked at me. There was a quiet in his face that I had never seen before, an exhaustion that was not physical but moral. "They asked me not to come," he said, and for the first time, I understood the full measure of what he had done. He had asked me to trust him with a dangerous plan. He had asked me to let go of the image I had of his wedding and accept a different kind of ceremony, one where truth would be the guest of honor. Outside, a car alarm began to wail, a thin, keening sound that made the windows vibrate. Inside, the house held its breath. I reached for the box, as if it were a lifeline, as if the papers inside could tell me who I had been and who I had become. When I opened the top, the first thing I saw was a photograph. Two people, younger, laughing in a way that made my chest ache. Beneath it, a folded confession in a hand I recognized. Beneath that, a name I had not heard spoken in years. The phone on the table buzzed. A message from an unknown number. A single line. "They're coming back for more." The light in the kitchen flickered, and for a moment the room was a study in shadows. I felt the old shame and a new fear rise together, braided and hot. My son looked at me, and in his eyes I saw the shape of the choice he had made. To break the silence, to risk everything, to force a family to look at itself. The front door opened again, and footsteps crossed the porch, slow, deliberate, and not alone. The hall smelled of roses and perfume, a sweetness that tried to mask the metallic tang of nerves. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen constellations, throwing fractured light across faces that had practiced their expressions for weeks. Cameras blinked like small, hungry eyes. Laughter rose in measured waves, polite and rehearsed, the kind that keeps dangerous things at bay. I arrived late because arriving early would have been a performance. The parking lot was a sea of black coats and whispered judgments. I stood for a moment by the car, feeling the cool night air press against my skin, and listened to the muffled music inside, an old song that had once meant something to me and now felt like a relic. My hands were empty. My invitation lay folded in my pocket like a promise I had already broken. Inside, the room was a map of alliances. Clusters of relatives formed islands. the cousin who loved a good story, the aunt who kept a ledger of sins, the bride's family with their polite, guarded smiles. They moved through the room with the ease of people who had rehearsed their roles. I watched them from the edge, a spectator to a ritual that had been planned down to the last breath. He was not on the stage. The groom's chair sat empty, a small, conspicuous absence that made the air feel thinner. People noticed. Eyes flicked, conversations stuttered. The MC made a joke about nerves, and the crowd laughed, but the laugh was brittle. I felt the weight of every gaze like a physical thing pressing in my shoulders, asking me to explain what I could not. Then the doors opened again. He walked in not with the swagger of a man who had won, but with the slow, deliberate steps of someone carrying a truth like a torch. He wore a dark suit that fit him like armor. In his hand, he held a small box, the same box he had set on our kitchen table days before. The room seemed to inhale. He did not go to the stage. He moved through the crowd with a purpose that made people step aside, as if they could sense the danger in his hands. Whispers followed him like a shadow. Someone called his name. Someone else asked if everything was all right. He smiled at none of them. He walked straight to the center of the room and set the box on a table that had been arranged for the cake, as if the confection were now a prop in a different play. The music stopped. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of expectation, like a held breath. He opened the box with hands that did not tremble. Inside were the letters, the photographs, the confession folded into a neat, terrible square. He took them out and placed them on the table as if laying out evidence. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, and his voice carried in a way that made the chandeliers shiver. "I asked my father not to come tonight because I needed to do something here that could not be done in whispers." A murmur ran through the room. The cousin who loved a good story straightened, his face a mask of curiosity and something like fear. The aunt who kept score clutched her clutch as if it were a talisman. The bride's mother looked at her daughter with an expression that was part confusion, part betrayal. He began to speak, and the words were not the rehearsed vows anyone had expected. He read from the letters, his voice steady, the cadence of someone who had practiced truth until it fit like a garment. He read confessions that named names and dates, that described promises made and promises broken, that revealed the architecture of a lie built to protect one person at the cost of many. As he read, faces changed, some flushed with shame, some paled, some looked away as if the light had become too bright. The cousin who had told the story for years found himself shrinking under the weight of facts he could not deny. The aunt who had kept score looked as if someone had taken a ledger from her hands and shown her the blank pages beneath. I watched my son and felt a strange, sharp pride that cut through the old shame. He had chosen a battlefield where the truth could not be ignored. He had chosen to make the family look at itself in a mirror it had avoided for decades. But as the letters unfolded, another truth emerged, one that none of us had expected. The confession he read was not only about my past. It implicated someone else, someone whose name had been whispered in the margins of family stories, but never spoken aloud. The letters revealed a betrayal that ran deeper than rumor, a calculated act by someone we had trusted, a decision made in panic that had been dressed up as protection. The person who had shaped our family's narrative had not been protecting us. They had been protecting themselves. Gasps punctuated the room like gunshots. The bride's father stood as if struck. The bride herself covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes wide and wet. The cousin who loved a good story looked as if he had been unmasked. The aunt who kept score began to cry, a sound that was not theatrical but raw and animal. "You lied," someone hissed. "You lied to us." The man at the center of the storm, our relative, the one who had spun the tale, rose slowly. His face was a study in denial and calculation. He opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again. For a moment, I thought he would confess, that the truth would finally be complete. Instead, he reached for the microphone and said, "This is a private matter. We should not air family business in public." The room split into factions. Some nodded, eager to return to the safety of silence. Others looked at my son with a new respect, as if he had given them permission to see. The bride's mother stepped forward, her voice small but fierce. "We invited you here to celebrate love," she said. "We did not invite you to destroy a family." "You invited us to celebrate a lie," my son replied. "You invited us to pretend that the story you were told was the whole story." The argument that followed was not polite. It was a collision of truths and defenses, of old grievances and new revelations. Voices rose. Accusations flew like shards of glass. People who had been friends for years found themselves on opposite sides of a chasm that had opened beneath their feet. I felt hands on my arm, my sister's trembling, and I realized I had been holding my breath. The room had become a theater of raw emotion. Anger, grief, betrayal, relief. The bride stood frozen, her bouquet slipping from her fingers. The groom's chair remained empty, a symbol of a choice that had already been made. Then, as if the night had been waiting for a single spark, the cousin who loved a good story stepped forward. He had always been the loudest voice in the room, the one who could turn a whisper into a verdict. He looked at my son with something like hatred and something like fear. "You think you can come here and rewrite history?" he shouted. "You think a few letters change what everyone knows?" My son's jaw tightened. "History is not what people say it is," he said. "History is what we can prove." The cousin laughed, a short, bitter sound. "Prove it then." My son reached into the box and pulled out a photograph. It was a picture of two people, one of them the cousin, standing in a doorway, younger, their faces lit by a flash. The cousin's expression in the photograph was not the one he wore now. It was a look of complicity. The room went still. The cousin's face drained of color. He lunged forward, hands out, as if to snatch the photograph away. A scuffle began, brief, ugly, human. Chairs scraped. Someone screamed. The chandelier above trembled, scattering light like broken promises. In the chaos, a figure moved through the crowd with a purpose that made the air colder. It was the person whose name had been revealed in the letters, the one who had been silenced for decades. They were older now, their hair silvered, their hands marked by time. They had come because my son had asked them to come, because he had promised them a stage where their voice could be heard. They stood at the edge of the scuffle and looked at the room with eyes that had seen too much. For a moment, no one moved. Then they spoke, and their voice was a thin, steady thing that cut through the noise. "I kept quiet for you," they said, and the words landed like a verdict. "I kept quiet because I was afraid. I kept quiet because I thought it would protect you. But the truth is heavier than my fear." The room shifted. People who had been shouting moments before now listened as if the air itself had changed. The bride's mother sank into a chair, her face a map of confusion and dawning understanding. The cousin who had loved a good story looked as if he might faint. My son watched the older person with an expression that was both tender and fierce. He had given them the courage to speak, and in doing so he had opened a door that could not be closed. The scuffle died down. The music, which had been a distant memory, began to play again, but it sounded different now, slower, uncertain, like a song that had lost its chorus. I felt something inside me shift, a tectonic movement that rearranged the landscape of my life. The old shame that had been a constant companion loosened its grip, not because it was forgiven, but because it had been seen for what it was, a story told to hide a different story. The family would not be the same after tonight. Some bridges would burn. Some wounds would begin to heal. And yet, even as the truth settled like dust, a new question rose, cold and precise. Who would pay for the damage that truth would do? Who would be left standing when the smoke cleared? The bride stood, her face pale, and walked toward the door. Her steps were slow, deliberate. She paused at the threshold, looked back at the room, and then at my son. For a heartbeat, the world held its breath. She opened the door and stepped out into the night. The hall erupted into a chaos of voices and movement. People surged toward the exit, toward the parking lot, toward the uncertain air outside. I reached for my son, but he was already moving, his face set like stone. He followed her out, and the door closed behind them with a sound that felt like a verdict. Inside, the room was left with the aftermath. Overturned chairs, a toppled cake stand, a scattering of petals like confetti for a funeral. The letters lay open on the table, their words exposed to the light. The cousin who loved a good story sat on the floor, his head in his hands. The aunt who kept score wept openly, her ledger forgotten. I stood in the center of the wreckage and realized that nothing about this night would be tidy. The truth had been spoken, but the consequences were only beginning. Outside, the night air was cold and sharp, and somewhere down the street a car, doors slammed like a punctuation mark. My son had chosen to break the silence. He had chosen to risk everything for a truth that would not be contained. He had asked me not to come so that the moment could be his, raw and unmediated. He had given us a choice, to keep living in the comfortable lie or to step into the dangerous light. As I stepped toward the door, I heard a voice behind me, soft, almost a whisper. "Are you coming?" I paused, feeling the weight of the decision like a hand on my chest. Then I moved because some truths demand witnesses, and some families demand reckoning. The night air hit me like a hand across the face, cold, sharp, smelling of crushed jasmine and spilled wine. Outside the hall, the parking lot was a scatter of headlights and the low murmur of people trying to make sense of what had just happened. I moved through the crowd like a man walking through fog, each step a small rebellion against the inertia of a life I had accepted. They were at the curb, two figures under a street lamp that made halos of their breath. The bride stood with her back to the light, her veil gone, hair loose and damp with sweat or rain. I could not tell which. My son leaned against the hood of a car, the box of letters at his feet like a small, dangerous altar. Between them the air was taut, a wire ready to snap. When I reached them, the bride's face was a map of exhaustion and something harder, decision. She looked at me for a second, and in that look I saw the 1,000 tiny calculations that had led her here. The vows she had rehearsed, the life she had imagined, the sudden, raw exposure of a family that had been built on half-truths. "You shouldn't have done it here," she said, voice low and steady. "You shouldn't have made them choose in front of everyone. You shouldn't have lied to me," my son said. His voice was a blade wrapped in velvet. "You shouldn't have let them tell me who I was." She laughed, a sound that had no humor. "You think I didn't know? You think I didn't see the way they looked at you? I knew something was wrong. I asked questions. I was told to trust them. I trusted them." Her hands trembled. She reached in her clutch and pulled out a small photograph, one I had not seen in the box. It was folded, edges worn. She handed it to my son as if it were a detonator. He opened it with the same careful reverence he had used on the letters. The photograph showed two people in a doorway, younger, their faces lit by a flash. One of them was the cousin. The other was someone else, someone whose face made my chest tighten with a recognition that was both old and new. "You knew," my son said. Not to her, but to the photograph, to the cousin, to the whole room that had been watching. "You knew and you marry me anyway." She looked at him, and for a moment the world narrowed to the space between them. "I married you because I loved you," she said. "Not because of their stories. I married you because I believed you were more than what they said." "And now," he asked, "now that the truth is out." She swallowed. "Now I don't know what I believe." The cousin's voice came from the doorway, thin and sharp. He had followed us outside, his face a mask of anger and something like fear. "You think you can drag my name through the mud?" he spat. "You think you can ruin me with a photograph and a few letters?" My son's jaw tightened. "I think I can show people what you did. I think I can show them that you lied to protect yourself." The cousin laughed, a brittle sound that did not reach his eyes. "You have no proof. You have a few scraps and a story. People will choose the comfortable lie over the messy truth." "You underestimate how tired we are of comfortable lies," my son said. You underestimate how many of us are ready to be done with your stories. The cousins stepped closer, and the air between them crackled. I felt the old, familiar urge to step in, to put my hand on my son's shoulder and tell him to stop. But something in me had shifted. The man who had once swallowed shame to keep a secret was not the man standing under the street lamp. My son had become a different kind of danger, one that refused to be soothed. You think you could destroy me? The cousin said. You think you could take everything I built and tear it down? My son's eyes were steady. I don't want to destroy you. I want to stop you from doing this to anyone else. The cousin's face contorted. You're a fool. Maybe, my son said. But I'd rather be a fool who tells the truth than a man who lives on other people's silence. The cousin's hand went to his pocket. For a second, I thought he might pull a phone, call for backup, call the family into formation. Instead, he pulled out an envelope and flung it at my son. The envelope burst open on the pavement, and a flurry of photographs scattered like wounded birds. They were not the same photographs we had seen in the box. These were newer, recent, images of people at parties, in cars, in private moments. Faces I recognized and faces I did not. The cousin's voice rose, triumphant and ugly. You want truth? Here's truth. I have things that will ruin you all. I can make sure no one trusts you again. The crowd that had gathered at the curb shifted, a living thing sensing the scent of blood. Phones came out. Someone filmed. Someone else whispered about lawsuits and revenge. The cousin's bravado was a thin veneer over something brittle. My son bent to gather the photographs, his hands moving with a speed that was almost mechanical. He looked up at the cousin and said, "If you want to play that game, then play it. But know this, the truth I have is not just letters and photos. I have witnesses. I have people who will stand up and say what they saw. I have the person you silenced." The cousin's face went white. For a moment, he looked like a man who had been struck. He took a step back, then another, as if the ground beneath him had become unstable. "You can't," he said. "You can't bring them back. They're gone. They don't want to be dragged into this." "They will come," my son said, "because they're tired of being hidden, because they want to be seen." A car door slammed. A woman's voice, sharp, controlled, cut through the night. Enough. It was the older person who had spoken at the wedding, the one whose silence had been the hinge of our family story. They had come out into the night, their shoulders squared against the cold. They looked at the cousin with a steadiness that made the man flinch. "You lied," they said, and the words were simple and final. "You lied to protect yourself. You told stories that made me small, so you could look bigger." The cousin's mouth opened and closed. He looked like a man trying to find a script he had not rehearsed. "You don't know what you're saying," he stammered. "I know exactly what I'm saying," the older person replied. "I remember the night. I remember the door. I remember the choice. I remember the way you smiled when you decided to tell a story that would make you the hero." The cousin's face crumpled. For a second, he looked like a child caught with his hand in a jar. Then he did something I did not expect. He laughed. It was a short, hysterical sound that did not fit the rest of the night. "You think this will change anything?" he said. "You think one night of drama will undo years of what I built? People will choose the version that keeps them comfortable. They will choose me. Maybe some will," my son said. "But not all, and not the ones who matter." The older person stepped forward and placed a hand on my son's arm. Their touch was light but fierce. "We will tell the truth," they said. "We will tell it until it is louder than his lies." The cousin's eyes darted to the crowd, to the phones, to the faces that had once been his audience. He saw the aunt who kept score, the relatives who had nodded along to his stories for years. He saw the bride's mother, her face a mixture of grief and something like relief. He saw the cousin's empire of whispers beginning to crumble. He turned and ran. The sound of his footsteps was a punctuation mark. People called after him. Someone shouted for security. A car peeled away, tires squealing. For a moment the night felt like a held breath released. We stood there, the three of us, my son, the older person, and me, Under the street lamp, the letters and photographs at our feet like the detritus of a battle. The bride leaned against the car, her shoulders shaking. She had not cried until now. When she did, it was not the theatrical sob of staged grief, but a small, private thing that made my chest ache. "I don't know what to do," she said, voice raw. "I wanted to believe in a family that loved me. I wanted to believe in a man who would protect me. I don't know who any of us are anymore." My son reached for her hand. His fingers were warm and steady. "We'll figure it out," he said. "Not tonight, not in a single speech, but we'll figure it out." The older person looked at me then, and in their eyes I saw something I had not expected. Forgiveness, not for me, but for the child I had once been. "You kept a secret to protect someone," they said. "You thought silence would save them, but silence can be a prison." I wanted to tell them that I had done what I had to do, that the choices I had made had been the only ones I could see at the time. I wanted to tell them that I had been a man who loved and feared in equal measure. But the words felt small. Instead, I nodded, and the nod felt like a confession. A siren wailed in the distance, a thin, urgent sound that made the night feel suddenly official. Someone in the crowd shouted that the cousin had been seen getting into a car with a man we did not know. Phones lit up like a constellation of accusation. Then my phone buzzed in my pocket. A message from an unknown number. "We have more." The message was short, clinical, and the 3 words landed like a new threat. My son read it over my shoulder, and his face went hard. "They're not done," he said. "This is bigger than we thought." The older person's hand tightened on my son's arm. "Then we keep going," they said. "We tell the truth until it cannot be ignored." The bride looked at us both, her eyes bright with a decision that was not yet formed. "If we do this," she said, "we will lose things. People will leave. People will hate us. But maybe we will also find something we never had, a family that knows the truth." The words hung in the air like a promise and a threat. The night around us seemed to hold its breath again, waiting for the next move. From a hall, a door slammed. A car engine started. The cousin's laughter, thin and bitter, echoed down the street for a moment, then faded. We stood under the street lamp, 3 figures in a world that had been rearranged. The letters at our feet were not just paper. They were the beginning of a reckoning. The photograph in my son's hand was not just an image. It was a key. Somewhere down the road, headlights cut through the dark. A figure stepped out of a car and walked toward us with a purpose that made my heart drop. It was someone I had not expected to see tonight, someone whose arrival would change everything again. The night air hit me like a hand across the face, cold, sharp, smelling of crushed jasmine and spilled wine. Outside the hall, the parking lot was a scatter of headlights and the low murmur of people trying to make sense of what had just happened. I moved through the crowd like a man walking through fog, each step a small rebellion against the inertia of a life I had accepted. They were at the curb, 2 figures under a street lamp that made halos of their breath. The bride stood with her back to the light, her veil gone, hair loose and damp with sweat or rain. I could not tell which. My son leaned against the hood of a car, the box of letters at his feet like a small, dangerous altar. Between them the air was taut, a wire ready to snap. When I reached them, the bride's face was a map of exhaustion and something harder, decision. She looked at me for a second, and in that look I saw the 1,000 tiny calculations that had led her here. The vows she had rehearsed, the life she had imagined, the sudden, raw exposure of a family that had been built on half-truths. "You shouldn't have done it here," she said, voice low and steady. "You shouldn't have made them choose in front of everyone." "You shouldn't have lied to me," my son said. His voice was a blade wrapped in velvet. "You shouldn't have let them tell me who I was." She laughed, a sound that had no humor. "You think I didn't know? You think I didn't see the way they looked at you? I knew something was wrong. I asked questions. I was told to trust them. I trusted them." Her hands trembled. She reached into her clutch and pulled out a small photograph, one I had not seen in the box. It was folded, edges worn. She handed it to my son as if it were a detonator. He opened it with the same careful reverence he had used on the letters. The photograph showed two people in a doorway, younger, their faces lit by a flash. One of them was the cousin. The other was someone else, someone whose face made my chest tighten with a recognition that was both old and new. "You knew," my son said, not to her, but to the photograph, to the cousin, to the whole room that had been watching. "You knew and you married me anyway." She looked at him, and for a moment the world narrowed to the space between them. "I married you because I loved you," she said, "not because of their stories. I married you because I believe you were more than what they said." "And now," he asked, "now that the truth is out." She swallowed. "Now I don't know what I believe." The cousin's voice came from the doorway, thin and sharp. He had followed us outside, his face a mask of anger and something like fear. "You think you could drag my name through the mud?" he spat. "You think you can ruin me with a photograph and a few letters?" My son's jaw tightened. "I think I can show people what you did. I think I can show them that you lied to protect yourself." The cousin laughed, a brittle sound that did not reach his eyes. "You have no proof. You have a few scraps and a story. People will choose the comfortable lie over the messy truth." "You underestimate how tired we are of comfortable lies," my son said. "You underestimate how many of us are ready to be done with your stories." The cousin stepped closer, and the air between them crackled. I felt the old, familiar urge to step in, to put my hand on my son's shoulder and tell him to stop. But something in me had shifted. The man who had once swallowed shame to keep a secret was not the man standing under the street lamp. My son had become a different kind of danger, one that refused to be soothed. "You think you could destroy me?" the cousin said. "You think you could take everything I built and tear it down?" My son's eyes were steady. "I don't want to destroy you. I want to stop you from doing this to anyone else." The cousin's face contorted. "You're a fool." "Maybe," my son said. "But I'd rather be a fool who tells the truth than a man who lives on other people's silence." The cousin's hand went to his pocket. For a second, I thought he might pull a phone, call for backup, call the family into formation. Instead, he pulled out an envelope and flung it at my son. The envelope burst open on the pavement, and a flurry of photographs scattered like wounded birds. They were not the same photographs we had seen in the box. These were newer, recent, images of people at parties, in cars, in private moments. Faces I recognized and faces I did not. The cousin's voice rose, triumphant and ugly. "You want truth? Here's truth. I have things that will ruin you all. I can make sure no one trusts you again." The crowd that had gathered at the curb shifted, a living thing sensing the scent of blood. Phones came out. Someone filmed. Someone else whispered about lawsuits and revenge. The cousin's bravado was a thin veneer over something brittle. My son bent to gather the photographs, his hands moving with a speed that was almost mechanical. He looked up at the cousin and said, "If you want to play that game, then play it. But know this, the truth I have is not just letters and photos. I have witnesses. I have people who will stand up and say what they saw. I have the person you silenced." The cousin's face went white. For a moment, he looked like a man who had been struck. He took a step back, then another, as if the ground beneath him had become unstable. "You can't," he said. "You can't bring them back. They're gone. They don't want to be dragged into this." "They will come," my son said, "because they're tired of being hidden, because they want to be seen." A car door slammed. A woman's voice, sharp, controlled, cut through the night. "Enough." It was the older person who had spoken at the wedding, the one whose silence had been the hinge of our family story. They had come out into the night, their shoulders squared against the cold. They looked at the cousin with a steadiness that made the man flinch. "You lied," they said, and the words were simple and final. "You lied to protect yourself. You told stories that made me small, so you could look bigger." The cousin's mouth opened and closed. He looked like a man trying to find a script he had not rehearsed. "You don't know what you're saying," he stammered. "I know exactly what I'm saying," the older person replied. "I remember the night. I remember the door. I remember the choice. I remember the way you smiled when you decided to tell a story that would make you the hero. The cousin's face crumpled. For a second, he looked like a child caught with his hand in a jar. Then he did something I did not expect. He laughed. It was a short, hysterical sound that did not fit the rest of the night. "You think this will change anything?" he said. "You think one night of drama will undo years of what I built? People will choose the version that keeps them comfortable. They will choose me. Maybe some will," my son said. "But not all, and not the ones who matter." The older person stepped forward and placed a hand on my son's arm. Their touch was light but fierce. "We will tell the truth," they said. "We will tell it until it is louder than his lies." The cousin's eyes darted to the crowd, to the phones, to the faces that had once been his audience. He saw the aunt who kept score, the relatives who had nodded along to his stories for years. He saw the bride's mother, her face a mixture of grief and something like relief. He saw the cousin's empire of whispers beginning to crumble. He turned and ran. The sound of his footsteps was a punctuation mark. People called after him. Someone shouted for security. A car peeled away, tires squealing. For a moment the night felt like a held breath released. We stood there, the three of us, my son, the older person, and me, under the street lamp, the letters and photographs at our feet like the detritus of a battle. The bride leaned against the car, her shoulders shaking. She had not cried until now. When she did, it was not the theatrical sob of a staged grief, but a small, private thing that made my chest ache. "I don't know what to do," she said, voice raw. "I wanted to believe in a family that loved me. I wanted to believe in a man who would protect me. I don't know who any of us are anymore." My son reached for her hand. His fingers were warm and steady. "We'll figure it out," he said. "Not tonight, not in a single speech, but we'll figure it out." The older person looked at me then, and in their eyes I saw something I had not expected. Forgiveness, not for me, but for the child I had once been. "You kept a secret to protect someone," they said. "You thought silence would save them. But silence can be a prison." I wanted to tell them that I had done what I had to do, that the choices I had made had been the only ones I could see at the time. I wanted to tell them that I had been a man who loved and feared in equal measure. But the words felt small. Instead, I nodded, and the nod felt like a confession. A siren wailed in the distance, a thin, urgent sound that made the night feel suddenly official. Someone in the crowd shouted that the cousin had been seen getting into a car with a man we did not know. Phones lit up like a constellation of accusation. Then my phone buzzed in my pocket. A message from an unknown number. "We have more." The message was short, clinical, and the three words landed like a new threat. My son read it over my shoulder, and his face went hard. "They're not done," he said. "This is bigger than we thought." The older person's hand tightened on my son's arm. "Then we keep going," they said. "We tell the truth until it cannot be ignored." The bride looked at us both, her eyes bright with a decision that was not yet formed. "If we do this," she said, "we will lose things. People will leave. People will hate us. But maybe we will also find something we never had, a family that knows the truth." The words hung in the air like a promise and a threat. The night around us seemed to hold its breath again, waiting for the next move. From the hall, a door slammed. A car engine started. The cousin's laughter, thin and bitter, echoed down the street for a moment, then faded. We stood under the street lamp, three figures in a world that had been rearranged. The letters at our feet were not just paper. They were the beginning of a reckoning. The photograph in my son's hand was not just an image. It was a key. Somewhere down the road, headlights cut through the dark. A figure stepped out of a car and walked toward us with a purpose that made my heart drop. It was someone I had not expected to see tonight, someone whose arrival would change everything again. The figure moved through the halo of headlights like a memory stepping out of shadow. At first I thought it was another guest, another relative drawn by the commotion. Then a street lamp caught their face, and the world narrowed to a single, impossible recognition. It was someone I had not seen in 20 years, someone whose absence had been a quiet ache in the house, a name we never spoke aloud. They walked toward us with a slow, deliberate gait, their coat buttoned against the night, breath steaming in the cold air. The letters at our feet seemed to shiver. For a moment, no one spoke. The cousin's car had already peeled away, tires screaming into the dark, and the crowd had thinned to a ring of faces that looked like they had been washed in acid. The bride stood with her hand in my son's, her knuckles white. The older person who had broken the silence at the wedding watched the newcomer with an expression that was equal parts relief and terror. "You came," my son said, as if the arrival had been a promise he had been waiting to keep. They nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible motion. Their eyes were older, rimmed with the kind of fatigue that comes from carrying a secret for decades. They had come because my son had asked them to come, because he had promised them a stage where their voice could be heard. They had come because the cousin's empire of whispers had finally become too heavy to bear. The newcomer's voice was thin but steady. "I thought I had buried it," they said. "I thought silence would keep us safe. But silence is a cage." The bride's breath hitched. She looked at the older person as if seeing them for the first time, and in that look I saw the collision of two lives, the life she had imagined and the life that had been kept from her. The street smelled of cold metal and crushed jasmine. Someone had left a half-empty cup of coffee on the hood of a car, its steam curling like a question. "You shouldn't have come." The cousin's voice echoed from somewhere down the road, thin and furious. He had not gone far. He had stopped at the corner, watching, calculating. He had not expected the person he had silenced to return. He had not expected the truth to have allies. The older person took a step forward. Their hands were steady, but their fingers trembled just enough to betray the weight of what they carried. "I kept quiet because I was afraid," they said. "I kept quiet because I thought it would protect you. But I was wrong. I was protecting a lie." A woman in the crowd, my sister, began to cry, a sound that was small and private and broke something inside me. The bride's mother pressed her hand to her mouth as if to hold in a scream. The cousin's face, visible in the distance, had gone pale. He looked like a man who had been unmasked and found himself suddenly very small. "You think this will change anything?" he shouted. "You think one person can undo what I've built? You built on other people's silence," the older person replied. "You built on fear. You told stories that made you the hero and everyone else the villain. You decided who would be believed and who would be forgotten." The cousin's jaw worked. He looked like a man trying to find a script he had not written. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said. "You don't know the consequences." "I know enough," the older person said. "I know that I lied to protect you. I know that I let you tell a story that made me small. I know that I kept quiet while you took the light." The bride's eyes filled with tears. She stepped closer to my son, as if to anchor herself to the only person she trusted in the chaos. "Why now?" she asked the older person. "Why tell us now after all these years?" The older person looked at her with a tenderness that made my chest ache. "Because I was asked," they said simply. "Because someone finally had the courage to say, 'We will not let this be the story anymore.'" A car door slammed in the distance. The cousin's silhouette retreated into the dark, but his voice remained, a thin thread of menace. "You'll regret this," he called. "You'll lose everything." "Maybe," my son said. "Maybe we will, but we'll lose it with our eyes open." The older person reached into their coat and pulled out a small packet of papers. They had been careful. They had kept copies, hidden things in places no one would think to look. They handed the papers to my son with a reverence that made the moment feel like a ritual. The papers were not just letters. They were records, receipts, names, dates, evidence that could not be dismissed as sentiment or memory. As my son read, his face changed. The lines around his mouth tightened. The light from the street lamp carved shadows into his cheekbones. He looked like a man who had been given a map to a place he had always suspected existed, but had never seen. "This is more than I thought," he said. "This is not just a story. This is a pattern." The crowd shifted. Phones came out again, the blue glow of screens painting faces in an eerie light. Someone filmed. Someone else whispered about lawyers and lawsuits. The cousin's threats felt smaller now, like the hiss of a cornered animal. You think this will end it? The cousin sneered from the dark. You think the world will care about your little revelations? The older person stepped forward, and for the first time I saw the full measure of their courage. We will make them care, they said. We will tell the truth until it is louder than his lies. A car pulled up at the curb, headlights cutting through the night. Two men stepped out, security, perhaps, or friends of the cousin. They moved with the practiced ease of people who had been called to contain a situation. The crowd tensed. The air smelled of gasoline and fear. One of the men approached us, his voice low and controlled. You need to leave, he said. This is private property. You're causing a disturbance. We're not leaving, my son said. Not until the truth is heard. The man's jaw tightened. He looked at the older person, then at the papers in my son's hand. You don't know what you're doing, he said. You don't know who you're messing with. I know enough, the older person replied. I know that silence has been used as a weapon. I know that people have been hurt. I know that it's time to stop. The security man's eyes flicked to the crowd, to the phones, to the faces that had gathered. He made a decision that surprised me. He stepped back. Perhaps he had seen too many nights like this, where the truth had a way of making even the most confident men hesitate. Perhaps he had a conscience. Or perhaps he had simply calculated that the optics of dragging an elderly person away from a wedding would be worse than letting the truth be spoken. The cousin cursed under his breath and retreated further into the dark. The car that had been waiting for him idled, then drove off, its taillights disappearing like a wound closing. For a moment the night felt like a hell breath. Then the older person began to speak, not to the crowd, not to the cameras, but to the people who had been hurt by the cousin's stories. They spoke in a voice that was steady and clear, a voice that had been tempered by years of regret. I remember the night, they said. I remember the door. I remember the choice. I remember the way we decided to tell a story that would make us safe. I remember the faces of the people we hurt. I remember the way silence felt like protection and turned into a prison. They named names. They described events with a clarity that made the cousin's version of history look like a child's drawing. They spoke of promises made and broken, of decisions taken in panic, of the small cruelties that had been dressed up as necessity. They spoke of the person who had been silenced, of the ways that silence had been used to shape a family's narrative. As they spoke, the crowd listened. The phones recorded. The words landed like stones, each one making a ripple. The bride's mother wept openly now, her shoulders shaking. My sister clutched my arm as if to anchor herself. The cousin's allies looked at each other with the dawning realization that their scaffolding was being dismantled. When the older person finished, there was a silence that felt like a verdict. The street seemed to hold its breath. Then, slowly, people began to speak, some in anger, some in apology, some in stunned confusion. The night had become a courtroom without a judge, and the jury was the family itself. I felt something inside me loosen, a pressure I had carried for years. It was not forgiveness. It was the beginning of a reckoning. The truth had been spoken, and with it came consequences that none of us could fully predict. A car door slammed down the block. Footsteps approached. Someone called a name. The cousin's voice, once so loud and certain, was now a distant echo. Then my phone buzzed again. Another message from an unknown number. He's not alone. The message was short, clinical, and the 3 words landed like a new threat. My son read it, and his face went hard. He looked at the older person, then at me, then at the bride. They're mobilizing, he said. They're not going to let this go quietly. The older person's hand tightened on my son's arm. Then we keep going, they said. We tell the truth until it cannot be ignored. The bride looked at us both, her eyes bright with a decision that was not yet formed. If we do this, she said, voice small but fierce, we will lose things. People will leave. People will hate us. But maybe we will also find something we never had, a family that knows the truth. The words hung in the air like a promise and a threat. The night around us seemed to hold its breath again, waiting for the next move. From the darkness, a car slowed and its window rolled down. A face I had not expected to see peered out, someone whose arrival would change the shape of the night in a way none of us could have predicted. Their smile was polite, their eyes cold. "Good evening," they said, and the way they said it made my skin crawl. "I think we need to talk." The man who stepped from the car wore a suit that had seen better days and a smile that did not reach his eyes. He moved with the calm of someone used to being obeyed, not argued with. For a moment, I thought he might be a lawyer, or a fixer, or one of the cousin's friends come to smooth the edges of a night gone wrong. Then he spoke, and his voice was a low instrument tuned to command. "Good evening," he said. "I'm here on behalf of those who prefer order to chaos." The words landed like a challenge. The street lamp threw his shadow long across the pavement, and the letters at our feet seemed to shrink away from the light. My son's jaw tightened. The older person who had come back to speak looked at the man with a wariness that made the lines around their eyes deepen. "You're late," my son said. "We were beginning to think you wouldn't show." The man's smile sharpened. "I always show when it matters." He glanced at the scattered photographs, the open letters, the small altar of truth we had made on the curb. "And it matters tonight." Around us, the crowd had thinned to a ring of faces that were no longer curious but hungry. Phones recorded, whispers threaded through the air like insects. The bride stood close to my son, her hand in his, her face pale but resolute. The older person kept their distance, as if the night had taught them to measure proximity. "What do you want?" the older person asked. The man's eyes flicked to them, then to me, then to the bride. "I want to remind you that truth has a price," he said, "and some people are willing to pay to keep it quiet." A cold wind moved down the street and carried with it the smell of exhaust and wet pavement. The man reached into his coat and produced a slim folder. He held it out like a peace offering or a threat. The line between the two was thin. "You have evidence," he said. "We have evidence. We can make this go away, or we can make it ruinous." My son's fingers tightened on the bride's hand. "We're not bargaining," he said. "We're telling the truth." The man's smile did not change. "Truth is expensive," he said, "and some truths are better left buried." A murmur rose from the crowd. Someone laughed, a brittle sound. The cousin's name was still a shadow at the edge of the night, but his presence was felt in the way people shifted, in the way alliances rearranged themselves like cards on a table. "You think you can intimidate us?" my son asked. "You think a folder and a threat will stop what's already begun?" The man's eyes were flat. "I think you don't understand the reach of what you've touched." He tapped the folder. "I think you don't understand who will be hurt if this spreads." The older person stepped forward, their voice small but steady. "We are already hurt," they said. "We have been hurt for years. We are tired of being hidden." The man's gaze flicked to them with something like pity. "You speak as if you are the only ones who have suffered," he said. "There are consequences to tearing down reputations. There are families who will be destroyed. There are livelihoods at stake. Then let them be destroyed by the truth," my son said. "Not by lies." The man's jaw tightened. For a second, I thought he might reach for the folder and walk away. Instead, he did something that made my stomach drop. He smiled, and the smile was a blade. "All right," he said. "We'll play your game. But know this. When the dust settles, someone will be left holding the bill." He turned and walked back to his car. The engine idled, a low hum that seemed to swallow the night. He did not leave. He sat in the driver's seat and watched us through the windshield like a man watching a fire he had started from safe distance. The cousin's car was gone, but his presence lingered like a scent. The man in the suit had the air of someone who could call that presence back with a single phone call. The thought made my hands cold. "We can't let him scare us," the bride said. Her voice was small but fierce. "We started this because we wanted the truth. We can't stop now because someone threatens us." My son nodded. "We keep going," he said. "We tell the truth. We find witnesses. We make sure the story is not just a rumor." The older person looked at him with a tenderness that made my chest ache. "You're brave," they said. But bravery is not armor. It's a choice. A car door slammed down the block. Footsteps approached. The crowd tightened like a fist. Someone shouted that the cousin had called his people. Someone else said the man in the suit was a fixer, a man who could make problems disappear. Then, as if the night had been waiting for a single spark, a voice cut through the air, sharp, metallic, and impossible to ignore. Stop! It was the cousin. He had returned, not alone this time. Two men flanked him, broad-shouldered and silent, their faces set like stone. He walked with a swagger that was more bravado than confidence, but he walked. The crowd parted like water around a rock. "You think you can humiliate me and walk away?" he said. His voice was a mixture of anger and wounded pride. "You think you could drag my name through the mud and expect no consequences?" My son stepped forward. "We're not dragging anyone," he said. "We're asking for the truth to be heard." The cousin laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Truth," he spat. "You have no idea what truth is. You have a photograph and some letters. You have a story that suits you. But I have proof. I have people who will say you're liars. I have recordings. I have witnesses who will make you regret this night." The man in the suit watched the exchange with a patience that made my skin crawl. He did not intervene. He let the cousin speak, as if the cousin's threats were part of a larger performance he had orchestrated. "You think you can ruin me?" the cousin said. "You think you can take everything I built? I will not let you." The two men at his side moved closer. One of them reached into his jacket. For a second, the world narrowed to the motion of a hand. My heart hammered against my ribs. The crowd gasped. Phones rose like a wall of blue light. "Don't," the older person said, voice small and urgent. "Please don't." The man at the cousin's side produced not a weapon, but a small recorder. He held it up like a trophy. "We have recordings," he said. "We have conversations. We have proof that your father," he pointed at me with a venom that made my skin crawl, "was involved in things that will make your son look like a fool." The word involved landed like a blow. My mouth went dry. For a moment I could not breathe. The air seemed to thicken, as if the night itself had become a thing that could choke. "You're lying," my son said. His voice was a thread of steel. The man smiled. "Am I?" He pressed play on the recorder. A voice came through, faint, distorted, but unmistakable. It was my voice, younger, raw with fear. I had not heard it in 20 years, but I recognized the cadence, the way I swallowed certain words. The recording was a fragment of a conversation I had had with someone whose name I had never spoken aloud. The words were clipped, hurried, a negotiation in panic. I felt the world tilt. The letters at our feet seemed to blur. The bride's hand tightened in mine until her knuckles went white. The older person's face went ashen. "You recorded me?" I said, though the question was useless. The recording continued, a loop of a night I had tried to bury. And I spoke of choices made in the dark, of promises kept at a cost, of a decision to take blame to protect someone else. The cousin laughed, triumphant. "See," he said, "you kept secrets. You lied. You made deals. You are not the victim you pretend to be." My son's face went hard. "That was then," he said. "People change. People do what they must." The man in the suit leaned forward, his eyes glittering. "People also pay for what they do," he said. "And some of us are very good at collecting debts." The recorder clicked off. The silence that followed was heavy, full of accusation. The crowd shifted, the ring of faces now a jury that had been given new evidence. The older person looked at me with a grief that felt like a physical thing. "You kept a secret to protect someone," they said. "But secrets have a way of becoming chains." I wanted to speak, to explain, to tell the story that had justified my silence. But the words felt small against the weight of the recording. The cousin's men closed in, their presence a physical pressure. The man in the suit watched with the patience of a predator. Then, as if the night had been waiting for a single, impossible rupture, a sound split the air, a sharp, bright crack that made the world jump. A car horn blared. A scream cut through the night. Someone shouted a name. The crowd surged, a living thing breaking into motion. I felt a hand on my shoulder, my sister's, trembling, and then the world tilted again as bodies moved, voices rose, and the street became a chaos of light and sound. In the middle of it all, the cousin's recorder lay on the pavement, its red light blinking like a heartbeat. The letters at our feet fluttered in the sudden wind, pages lifting like white flags. And then, from somewhere in the press of bodies, a single terrible sound, a gunshot. The sound of the gunshot hung in the air like a bell struck in a cathedral, sharp, impossible to ignore, reverberating in the bones. For a second, the world narrowed to a single, bright point. The flash, the smell of burnt powder, the metallic tang that rose like a tide in my mouth. Then everything exploded outward. Voices, movement, the scrape of shoes on pavement, the frantic blue light of phones recording, the high, animal cry of someone who had been startled into terror. People scattered like startled birds. The cousin's two men moved as if pulled by a single string. One lunged, the other stumbled. The man with the recorder went down, the device skittering across the asphalt and coming to rest against a curb, its red light still blinking like a heartbeat. The letters at our feet fluttered, pages lifting and settling like wounded wings. I felt my knees go weak. For a moment, I could not tell if the sound that filled my ears was the echo of the shot or the pounding of my own heart. The bride's hand tightened in mine until her fingers ached. Her face was white, her lips parted in a sound that might have been a scream or a prayer. My son's eyes were wide and bright, the way they look when he's about to do something he knows will change everything. "Who?" someone began, and the question died in the press of bodies. The man in the suit stood where he had been, his posture unruffled, as if the world had not just been split open. For a heartbeat, I thought he had been hit. Then I saw the small pistol in his hand, the smoke curling from its barrel like a thin, obscene ribbon. He had fired. He had fired into the crowd. The cousin's man who had been holding the recorder lay on the ground, his hand pressed to his side. Blood darkened his shirt in a spreading stain, but the wound was not where a fatal shot would land. It was a shallow, messy thing that made him gasp and curse and clutch at life. He was alive, but the sound he made was a raw, animal noise that made the hair on my arm stand up. "You bastard," someone shouted. "You shot him." The man in the suit smile was small and precise. He did not look like a man who had panicked. He looked like a man who had planned this moment and chosen its punctuation. "I warned you," he said, his voice low and controlled. "I told you truth has a price." The older person who had come back to speak stepped forward, their face a mask of fury and fear. "You shot an unarmed man," they said. "You have no right." "He had a recorder," the man in the suit said. "He was collecting things. He was building a case. He was going to ruin people." "You don't get to decide that," my son said. His voice was a blade. "You don't get to play judge and executioner." The man in the suit's eyes flicked to my son, and for a second something like recognition passed over his face. It was a small thing, a micro-expression that landed like a stone in my chest. The world tilted. I knew that look. I had seen in a photograph, in a letter, in the memory of a night I had tried to bury. It was the look of someone who had been saved by another's silence. My breath caught. The man in the suit smiled again, and this time the smile was not for the crowd. It was for me. "You kept this secret once," he said, and the words were a key turning in a lock. "You kept it from me." The air went thin. The older person's hand flew to their mouth. The bride's eyes widened as if a light had been switched on behind her. My son's face went hard, a mask of disbelief and anger. "You," I said, though the name did not come. The memory rose like smoke. A younger face, a promise made in a room that smelled of disinfectant and fear, a bargain struck with a man who had power and a man who had none. I had taken the blame. I had swallowed the shame. I had thought it would protect someone I loved. I had thought silence would be a shield. "You kept it well," the man in the suit said. "Too well." You made me untouchable. You made me free to build what I wanted. And now you come here with your son, and you think you can expose me with a few letters? The cousin's voice was a thin, furious thing from the edge of the crowd. He had not fled entirely. He crouched near his fallen man, eyes wild. You shot him, he said. You'll pay for this. The man in the suit laughed, a sound that had no warmth. I don't pay, he said. I collect. A siren wailed in the distance, a thin, urgent sound that made the night feel suddenly official. Someone in the crowd shouted that the police were on their way. Phones rose like a wall of blue light. Faces illuminated in an eerie glow. The man in the suit smile did not change. He looked at the approaching lights with the calm of a man who had already calculated every outcome. You should have stayed away, he said to me, and the words were not a question. You should have let the past stay buried. My hands trembled. I wanted to tell him that I had done what I had to do, that the choices I had made had been the only ones I could see at the time. I wanted to tell him that I had loved and feared and tried to protect. But the words felt small against the weight of the pistol in his hand and the blood on the pavement. The older person moved toward the fallen man, their voice shaking as they called for help. Someone in the crowd, my sister perhaps, pressed a hand to the wound, trying to staunch the flow. The man with the recorder coughed and spat and cursed, and the sound of his voice was a ragged thing that made my stomach drop. Call an ambulance, my son said. His voice was steady, but there was a tremor under it like a wire under tension. He looked at the man in the suit with something that was not just anger, but a dawning, terrible understanding. Who are you? The man in the suit's eyes were cold and bright. I am what you made me, he said. I am the consequence of your silence. The sirens grew louder. A police car turned the corner, its lights painting the street in frantic blues and reds. Officers spilled out, uniforms crisp, radios crackling. They moved with the practiced efficiency of people trained to contain chaos. Someone shouted for everyone to stay back. Someone else shouted that there had been a shooting. The man in the suit did not move. He watched the officers approach with the same calm he had worn since he arrived. When they reached him, one of them barked a question. He raised his hands slowly, the pistol still in his grip. For a moment, I thought he would be arrested, that the night would end in handcuffs and paperwork and the slow, grinding machinery of justice. Instead, he lowered the pistol and smiled at the officers as if greeting old acquaintances. I was protecting people, he said. I fired a warning shot. He was going to escalate. The officers exchanged looks. One of them moved to cuff him, then hesitated, glancing at the cousin's wounded man, at the scattered letters, at the crowd that had gathered like a jury. The man in the suit smile did not falter. He produced a card from his pocket and handed it to the officer, a card with a name and a number and an authority that made the officer's jaw tighten. This is a matter for hire, the man said. Call the precinct. Call the captain. This is not a street-level incident. The officer's hand hovered over the cuffs. The man in the suit's card glinted in the streetlight like a talisman. The officer looked at it, then at the man, then at the crowd. He made a decision that felt like a betrayal and a relief all at once. He stepped back. You're under investigation, he said, voice flat. But we need statements. We need to secure the scene. The man in the suit nodded, as if the words were a formality. He slipped the pistol into his coat and folded his hands. Of course, he said. Of course. As the officers moved through the crowd, taking statements, photographing the scene, the man in the suit turned to me. His eyes were bright with a triumph that made my stomach drop. You kept me safe once, he said. You owe me. Your son owes me. Your family owes me. My son's face went white. You used my father, he said. You used him to hide your crimes. The man in the suit smile was a blade. I used what I needed, he said. And now you will help me finish what I started. The older person stepped between us, their voice a thin, fierce thing. No, they said. We will not be your instruments. The man in the suit's eyes flicked to them, and for a second I saw something like regret. Quick, almost human, before it was gone. You had your chance, he said. You chose silence. Now you will choose differently. A police officer called for an ambulance. Someone wrapped the wounded man in a jacket and lifted him into a car. The cousin was led away by two officers, his hands cuffed behind his back, his face a mask of fury and humiliation. The man in the suit watched it all with the calm of a man who had orchestrated a symphony and now listened to its final movement. I felt the old secret press against my ribs like a living thing. The man in the suit had been the reason I had taken the blame. I had thought my silence would protect someone I loved. I had not imagined that the person I had protected would return with a pistol and a ledger and a hunger for repayment. My son looked at me then, his eyes full of questions I could not answer. "Who is he?" he asked. "Who did you protect?" I opened my mouth, and the words I had kept for 20 years came out like a confession. "His name is Farid," I said. "I kept him safe. I thought I was saving a life." The man in the suit's smile widened. "Farid," he said, "a good name. A useful name." The sirens grew louder. The night smelled of smoke and jasmine and something older. Fear, perhaps, or the metallic tang of consequences. The letters lay scattered like the bones of a story we had all thought we knew. The man in the suit stepped closer, his shadow falling over them like a verdict. "You will help me," he said softly, "or you will watch everything you love burn." The words were not a threat. They were a promise. Behind him, the wounded man moaned. The cousin cursed. The officers moved with the slow, bureaucratic efficiency of people who had seen too many nights like this. The bride leaned against my son, her breath coming in short, sharp pulls. The older person's hands trembled. I felt the weight of the choice I had made years ago settle on my shoulders like a stone. I had thought silence was protection. I had not imagined it would become a debt collector. The man in the suit looked at me with a patience that made my skin crawl. "You kept me safe," he said. "Now keep me safe again." The world narrowed to the space between his eyes and mine. The night held its breath. Then, from the press of bodies, a phone rang, sharp, bright, ordinary. The sound cut through the tension like a blade. The man in the suit's smile faltered for the briefest of seconds. Someone answered. A voice spoke. The words were muffled, but the name that came through made the blood drain from my face. "Captain Aslam is on his way," the voice said. "He wants to speak to Farid personally." The man in the suit's face changed. For the first time since he had arrived, there was a flicker of something like fear. He looked at the approaching lights, then at me, then at the papers on the ground. "You kept me safe," he said again, but the words were thinner now, edged with uncertainty. "You will keep me safe." I looked at my son. I looked at the bride. I looked at the older person who had finally found a voice. The choice I had made decades ago had come back to demand payment, and the currency was my family. The sirens grew louder. The night closed in. The man in the suit straightened, his jaw set, and for a moment the world held its breath, waiting to see which way the debt would be paid. The night smelled of wet asphalt and burnt powder, a metallic tang that clung to my tongue. Sirens painted the street in frantic blues and reds, their lights strobing across faces that had been rearranged by truth and violence. People clustered in small, trembling islands, some on their phones, some on their knees, some staring as if the world had become a film they could not look away from. The letters lay scattered like fallen leaves, pages fluttering in the wind, each one a small accusation. I felt the weight of the man in the suit's gaze like a physical thing. He had fired into the crowd, and then, with the calm of a man who had rehearsed every outcome, folded the pistol away and produced a card that made the officers hesitate. He had the look of someone who had been given power and learned how to spend it. He had a name, Farid, and that name had been the reason I had swallowed shame years ago. Now he stood under the street lamp, a silhouette of menace and entitlement. In the past, I tried to bury rose up to demand payment. An officer barked orders. People shuffled back. The wounded man groaned, blood dark and sticky against his shirt. The cousin, cuffed and furious, spat at the pavement. The man in the suit, Farid, watched the scene with a patience that made my skin crawl. He was not afraid of the police. He was not afraid of anything. He had built a life on other people's silence. Captain Aslam arrived like a storm. He stepped from the car with a presence that cut through the chaos. Broad shoulders, a face that had seen too many nights, eyes that missed nothing. He moved with the authority of someone who had been called to clean up messes others had made. When he saw Fard, his jaw tightened. Recognition flashed across his face, quick and private, like a memory of a file pulled from a drawer. "Fard Khan," he said, voice low, "you're under arrest for assault with a deadly weapon." Fard's smile did not falter. He folded his hands as if in prayer. "Captain," he said, as if greeting an old acquaintance. "You know me. You know what I do. I was protecting people." Aslam's eyes flicked to me, then to the letters on the ground. He took in the scene with a professional calm. "We'll take statements," he said. "We'll secure the scene. No one leaves." Fard's gaze slid to me, and for a moment the world narrowed to the space between us. He stepped forward, close enough that I could smell the faint cologne that had always been part of his armor. "You kept me safe once," he said softly. "You owe me." My son's hand tightened on the bride's. His face was a mask of fury and exhaustion. "We're not bargaining," he said. "We're done being your currency." Fard's smile sharpened. "You think this is about money?" he asked. "You think this is about favors? This is about survival. You think you can expose me and expect no consequences? You think the world will side with you because you have letters and a photograph?" Captain Aslam's voice cut through. "Mr. Khan, step back. You're under arrest." Fard's eyes flicked to the officers. For a second, I thought he might resist. Instead, he raised his hands and allowed them to cuff him, the motion theatrical, as if he were performing for an audience. The officers led him toward the squad car, and the crowd parted like a sea. He turned his head and looked at me one last time. "You will help me," he said, low enough that only I could hear, "or you will watch everything burn." The officers pushed him into the car. The door slammed. The engine idled. For a moment, I thought the night might end in paperwork and the slow, grinding machinery of justice. Then a phone in Fard's pocket buzzed. He answered it with the casual ease of a man who had a network that hummed like a hive. "Yes," he said into the phone. His voice was calm, almost conversational. "He's been contained. For now." The officer at the car's window frowned. "Who are you talking to?" he asked. Fard smiled at the officer with a patience that made my blood run cold. "People," he said. "People who care." He hung up and looked at me again. "You think arrest is the end?" he asked. "You think a captain in a squad car can undo what I built? You think your son's little crusade will topple a house of cards?" Captain Aslam's jaw tightened. He leaned into the car window and spoke in a voice that was all procedure. "We'll investigate. We'll take statements. We'll follow the evidence." Fard's laugh was soft. "You'll follow what you're allowed to follow," he said. "There are lines you don't cross. There are names you don't speak. You know that, Captain." Aslam's face did not change, but his eyes flicked to the radio at his shoulder. He had the look of a man who knew the map of power in this city, the invisible lines where influence met law. He looked at me, then at my son, then at the older person who had finally found a voice. "We'll do our job," he said, "but be careful. This is bigger than a family feud." The words landed like a warning. The crowd thinned as people realized the night had shifted from scandal to danger. Phones still recorded, but the tone had changed. The thrill of gossip had been replaced by the sober knowledge that someone had been shot and a powerful man had been arrested. We were escorted to the police station to give statements. The fluorescent lights inside felt harsh and small after the street lamp's halo. Officers took notes, typed on keyboards, asked questions with the clinical detachment of people who had seen too many versions of human drama. I watched my son as he spoke, his jaw set, his voice steady. He read from the letters. He described the photograph. He explained why he had asked me not to come. He did not flinch when the recorder captured his words. When it was my turn, the officer asked me to recount the events. I felt the old secret like a stone in my chest. The recording from the cousin's man had been played at the curb. The words I had spoken years ago were now evidence. I had thought my silence would protect someone I loved. I had not imagined that silence would become a ledger that could be used against me. "Why did you keep quiet?" the officer asked, pen poised. "Because I thought it would save a life," I wanted to say. "Because I loved someone enough to take the fall. Because I was afraid of what would happen if the truth came out." But the words felt small in the fluorescent room. Instead, I said, "I thought I was protecting someone." The officer nodded, not unkindly. "Who?" I hesitated. The name had been a ghost in my life for 20 years. Saying it aloud felt like opening a wound. "Farid," I said. The name landed in the room like a confession. The officer's pen paused. He looked at me with a new interest. "Farid Khan," he repeated. "The businessman? The one with political ties?" I swallowed. Yes. Outside, the city hummed with a life that did not stop for our revelations. The bride sat with her head in her hands. The older person held a cup of tea that had gone cold. My son's shoulders trembled once, then steadied. The police took our statements, cataloged the letters, photographed the scene. Captain Aslam moved through the station with a purpose, making calls, checking names, his face a map of concentration. When the officers returned, their expressions were guarded. "We have to be honest with you," one said. "This is not a simple case. Mr. Khan has connections. We will do what we can, but there will be pressure." Pressure. The word was a small, precise thing that made my chest tighten. I had known, in the abstract, that the man I had protected had power. I had not imagined that power would come back like a debt collector, demanding repayment in the currency of my family's safety. My son looked at me then, his eyes bright with a question that had no easy answer. "Did you know?" he asked. "Did you know how far this would go?" I wanted to tell him that I had not known, that I had been a man who had made a choice in a room full of fear and thought it would be enough, that I had not imagined the man I had protected would become a monster. But the truth was more complicated. I had known enough to be afraid. I had known enough to be careful. I had known enough to keep my mouth shut. "I knew he had influence," I said. "I did not know he would become this." Captain Aslam's phone buzzed. He answered, listened, and his face went tight. He looked at us with a gravity that made the room feel smaller. "There's been a call," he said. "Someone claiming to be from the governor's office wants to speak to Mr. Khan. They're asking for him to be released to their custody." The words landed like a blow. The room seemed to tilt. The officer who had been taking notes looked suddenly very young. Captain Aslam's jaw worked. "We will not release him without due process," he said. "We will follow procedure." The phone buzzed again. The caller ID flashed a number that belonged to a private line, a number that did not appear in public directories. The officer who answered paled. "They want to see the evidence," he said. "They want to review the statements." Farid's name on the caller ID would be a key. The governor's office, the private line. These were the invisible hands that could move mountains. The man I had protected had not only built an empire, he had built a shield. My son's face went hard. "They can't intimidate us," he said. "We told the truth." Captain Aslam looked at him with a tired kindness. "Truth is not always enough," he said. "But it's a start." Outside, the night pressed against the windows like a living thing. The letters lay in evidence bags now, their words preserved like relics. The cousin sat in a holding cell, furious and small. The wounded man had been taken to the hospital. His prognosis was uncertain. Farid sat in an interview room, calm and composed, his hands folded. Then the phone on Captain Aslam's desk rang again. He answered, listened, and his face went still. He looked at us with a new, private calculation. "They want to meet," he said. "They want to see the evidence in person. They want to speak to the family." The words were an invitation and a threat. The governor's office, or someone pretending to be them, wanted to mediate. They wanted to see the letters, to weigh the cost of exposure. They wanted to know whether the family would be willing to negotiate. My son's jaw tightened. The bride's hand found his. The older person's fingers trembled around their cup. I felt the old secret like a live wire under my skin. The man I had protected had returned with a pistol and a ledger and a network that reached into rooms I had never imagined. Captain Aslam closed his eyes for a second, then opened them with a resolve that steadied the room. "We will not be bullied," he said. "We will follow the law. We will protect witnesses. But be prepared. This will not be clean." The words were a promise and a warning. The night had become a chessboard, and the pieces were moving with a speed that made my head spin. Farad's arrest had not ended anything. It had only revealed the next layer of the game. As we left the station into the cold night, the city felt different, sharper, more dangerous. The letters and evidence bags were a fragile kind of power. The photograph in my son's pocket was a key. The man in the suit had been contained for now, but his network hummed like a hive, and the call from a private line had shown us how deep the roots went. We walked into the night with the knowledge that the next move would not be ours alone. The debt collector had been arrested, but his creditors were still at large. The choice I had made years ago had come back to demand payment, and the currency was my family's safety. Behind us, the police station's lights glowed like a promise that justice might be possible. Ahead of us, the city stretched, full of rooms where deals were made and secrets kept. The night had not ended. It had only begun to reveal its true shape. A car idled at the curb. The driver's window rolled down. A voice from inside said, "We can help you, if you're willing to make a deal." My son looked at me. The bride looked at him. The older person looked at the ground. I felt the old secret press against my ribs like a living thing, and I knew that whatever choice we made next would change everything. The offer hung in the air like a cigarette smoke ring, thin, perfumed, and poisonous. The man in the idling car had rolled down his window and spoken with the casual menace of someone who trades in favors and consequences. His voice had been smooth, practiced. "We can help you, if you're willing to make a deal." We stood under the sodium glow of the street lamp, the city breathing around us in a rhythm that felt suddenly foreign. The letters and evidence bags were a fragile kind of power. The photograph in my son's pocket was a key. Farad sat in the back of the squad car, cuffed but unbowed, his eyes like chips of flint. Captain Aslam's jaw was a hard line. The bride's hand found my son's again, fingers interlaced like a lifeline. The older person, who had finally spoken, kept their gaze on the ground, as if the night had taught them to measure every step. "Who are you?" my son asked the man in the car, voice low and steady. The man smiled as if he had been asked a charming question. "Names don't matter," he said. "Conexiones do. We can make this go away. We can make sure the letters never see the light of day. We can protect you from the fallout." The offer was a mirror held up to our faces. On one side, safety, quiet, the slow erasure scandal. On the other, truth, exposure, the risk of losing everything. The choice felt like standing at the edge of a cliff with a storm behind you and a long fall ahead. Captain Aslam's eyes narrowed. He had the look of a man who had been offered a bribe and had learned to smell it. "We don't negotiate on the street," he said. "If you have something to say, say it to the precinct." The man in the car shrugged. "I prefer discretion," he said. "But if you insist on a public performance, we could do that too. The governor's office has already called. They want to mediate. They want to see the evidence. They want to know whether this family is willing to make a deal." The words landed like a blow. The bride's face went pale. My son's fingers dug into her hand until his knuckles blanched. The older person's lips pressed together until they were a thin line. "Make a deal," the bride whispered. "What kind of deal?" The man's smile widened. "A deal where reputations are preserved, where careers are spared, where the story is reframed as a misunderstanding rather than a conspiracy. You sign a statement, we arrange a retraction, we make sure the right people get quieted. You keep your family. You keep your lives. And what do you want in return?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Everything has a price." The man's eyes flicked to Fard in the squad car, then back to me. "Cooperation," he said. "Names. Access. A willingness to step back when asked. We don't want enemies. We want partners." The night seemed to tilt. The sirens had faded into the city's background hum, but the tension remained, a live wire under our skin. Captain Aslam's radio crackled. He listened, then looked at us with a tired, private calculation. "We'll take statements," he said. "We'll secure the evidence. But any suggestion of coercion will be investigated." The man in the car laughed softly. "Of course," he said. "We're all for the law. We just prefer to avoid spectacle." A woman's voice, sharp, controlled, cut through the air. She had stepped out of the crowd, a figure in a dark coat, her hair pulled back in a no-nonsense knot. She moved with the authority of someone used to being obeyed. When she reached us, she did not introduce herself. She did not need to. "You're not making a deal tonight," she said to the man in the car. Her voice was a blade wrapped in velvet. "Not here. Not like this." The man's smile faltered. He looked at her with a flicker of recognition that made my skin prickle. "And who are you?" he asked, but the question was rhetorical. She glanced at Captain Aslam, then at the squad car where Fard Saturday. "I'm someone who knows how to read the room," she said. "And I'm someone who knows what happens when deals are made in the dark." Captain Aslam relaxed a fraction. The woman's presence felt like a counterweight. She had the air of someone who could call the governor's office and make them wait. She had the look of a fixer who had chosen a different kind of life, one that bent power toward justice rather than profit. "Then what do you want?" the man in the car asked, his tone suddenly less sure. She looked at us, at my son, at the bride, at the older person, at me. Her eyes were steady, and in them I saw a calculation that was both practical and humane. "I want the truth to be heard in a way that doesn't get buried," she said. "I want witnesses protected. I want the evidence preserved. And I want you to know that if you try to buy silence, there will be consequences." The man in the car's jaw tightened. He rolled up his window, slowly, the motion like a closing curtain. "We'll be in touch," he said, and the car pulled away into the night, its taillights a pair of red eyes disappearing into the dark. For a moment the street felt like a battlefield after a skirmish, smoke, scattered debris, the metallic tang of adrenaline. The woman turned to Captain Aslam. "You need to move forward to a secure facility," she said. "And you need to make sure the evidence is cataloged and duplicated. If the governor's office calls, you tell them you're following procedure. You don't let them dictate the investigation." Aslam nodded. "Understood," he said. "Who are you?" She smiled, but it was not a friendly smile. "Call me Noor," she said. "I work with people who don't like to be bullied." Noor's arrival felt like a pivot. She had the kind of presence that made people recalibrate. She moved through the crowd with a purpose that made the night feel less like a spectacle and more like a scene in which choices mattered. We were escorted back to the precinct to give fuller statements. The fluorescent lights inside felt clinical and small after the street lamp's halo. Officers took our accounts, cataloged the letters, photographed the scene. Captain Aslam moved through the station with a focus that steadied the room. Noor stayed close, a quiet sentinel. When it was my turn to speak, the officer asked me to recount the events again. The recording from the cousin's man had been played at the curb. The words I had spoken years ago were now evidence. I felt the old secret like a stone in my chest. Saying Fard's name aloud had been a confession. Saying it again felt like opening a wound. "Why did you keep quiet?" the officer asked, pen poised. "Because I thought it would save a life," I wanted to say. "Because I loved someone enough to take the fall. Because I was afraid of what would happen if the truth came out." But the words felt small under the fluorescent glare. Instead, I said, "I thought I was protecting someone." The officer's pen scratched. "Who?" "Farid Khan," I said. The name landed in the room like a verdict. Noor's hand touched my shoulder, a brief, grounding pressure. "You did what you thought was right," she said quietly. "But right now, we need to make sure the truth survives." Outside, the city hummed with a life that did not stop for our revelations. The bride sat with her head in her hands. My son's shoulders trembled once, then steadied. The older person held a cup of tea that had gone cold. Captain Aslam made calls, his voice a low instrument of procedure. Noor moved through the station like someone who could see the map of power and knew where to place her pieces. When the officers returned, their expressions were guarded. "We have to be honest with you," one said. "This is not a simple case. Mr. Khan has connections. We will do what we can, but there will be pressure." Pressure. The word was a small, precise thing that made my chest tighten. The man I had protected had not only built an empire, he had built a shield. The governor's office had already called. The man in the car had promised deals. The city's invisible lines of influence hummed like a web. Nur leaned in, her voice low. "We'll make copies of everything," she said. "We'll get the letters to a secure lawyer. We'll get witnesses into safe houses if we have to. But you have to be willing to fight. You have to be willing to let the truth be messy." My son's jaw tightened. "We are," he said. "We started this because we wanted the truth." Nora's eyes softened for a fraction. "Good," she said. "Because the people who built their lives on other people's silence don't give up easily." The precinct hummed with activity. Officers moved like chess pieces. Farid's file was pulled. The cousin's statements were cataloged. The wounded man's condition was updated, stable but shaken. The governor's office called again, and Captain Aslam listened with a face that did not betray his thoughts. When the call ended, he looked at us with a gravity that made the room feel smaller. "They want a meeting," he said. "They want to see the evidence. They want to negotiate." Nora's jaw tightened. "We don't negotiate with extortionists," she said. "We present facts. We let the law do its work." The phone buzzed again. A message flashed on my son's screen. "Someone's been paid to silence a witness." The sender was anonymous. The message was short and clinical, and the 3 words landed like a new threat. We were not alone in the fight. We had a captain who wanted to do his job, a fixer who had chosen a different path, and a son who had decided that truth was worth the cost. But the city had other plans. Farid's network hummed like a hive. The governor's office wanted to mediate. The man in the car had promised to be in touch. Nur looked at us, her eyes steady. "Tomorrow we go public," she said. "We file the evidence with the press, with the court, with anyone who will listen. We make sure the story cannot be buried." The words were a promise and a threat. The night had become a crucible. The letters and evidence bags were a fragile kind of power. The photograph in my son's pocket was a key. The man in the car had offered a deal. Nur had offered a plan. Outside, the city breathed. Farid's name was a shadow that would not be easily erased. The governor's office had called. The man in the car had driven away. The precinct hummed with the slow, bureaucratic machinery of justice. As we left the station into the cold night, Nora's hand on my son's shoulder was a small, fierce thing. "Be ready," she said. "They will come for you." We walked into the dark with the knowledge that the next move would not be ours alone. The debt collector had been arrested, but his creditors were still at large. The choice I had made years ago had come back to demand payment, and the currency was my family's safety. A car idled at the curb. Its window rolled down. A voice from inside said, polite and cold, "We'll be watching." The morning came like a dare, pale light through rain-streaked glass, the city still smelling of last night's adrenaline and wet asphalt. We met at a neutral room in the governor's building, a place with too many polished surfaces and the kind of carpet that swallows footsteps. Nur had arranged it. A mediator from the governor's office, Captain Aslam, 2 officers, a lawyer with a practiced smile, and a small army of aides who moved like shadows. Farid sat in a glass-walled interview room down the hall, cuffed but composed, his profile a dark silhouette against the window. The air in the conference room tasted of coffee and disinfectant. Papers were stacked in neat piles, evidence bags glinted under fluorescent light, and the photograph in my son's pocket felt heavier than it had on the curb. Cameras were not allowed, but the room hummed with the knowledge that every word could leak, every pause could be weaponized. Nora stood at the head of the table like a conductor, her presence a promise that someone had thought this through. The mediator, an official with a voice like velvet and a face that had learned to be unreadable, opened the meeting with the kind of civility that always precedes a knife. We are here to find a resolution that protects the public interest and preserves stability, she said. Her words were a soft net thrown over a pit of vipers. Farid's lawyer arrived late, his tie slightly askew, as if he had been in a hurry to get to the theater of negotiation. He carried a leather folder that smelled faintly of cigars and old money. He smiled at us with the practiced warmth of someone who had never had to worry about consequences. "We represent Mr. Khan," he said. "He is willing to consider a settlement that spares both families public humiliation. A retraction, a donation to a charity of your choosing, and a mutual non-disparagement agreement. In exchange, the evidence will be sealed and the matter closed." The offer was a velvet glove over an iron fist. It was everything Farid wanted: control, silence, the ability to keep building on the foundation he had laid. It was also a test, an invitation to trade truth for safety. My son's jaw tightened. He had the look of a man who had rehearsed his refusal. "We didn't come here to be bought," he said. His voice was steady, but I could hear the tremor beneath it, the tremor of someone who knew what losing would feel like. The lawyer's smile did not falter. "This is not about buying. It is about preventing chaos. Think of the families involved. Think of reputations. Think of the children." The bride's mother, who had been silent until now, pressed her fingers together until the knuckles whitened. Her eyes were red from sleeplessness. "We invited you to celebrate love," she said. "We did not invite you to destroy lives." Nor leaned forward. "We will not be intimidated," she said. "We will follow the law. We will protect witnesses. If Mr. Khan has committed crimes, he will be held accountable." The mediator's face remained neutral, but her eyes flicked to the lawyer and then to the phone on the table. "We must be pragmatic," she said. "There are political considerations. There are livelihoods. We can proceed with an investigation, but it will be slow. Or we can negotiate a settlement that prevents further harm." The word pragmatic felt like a blade. The room split into two invisible camps: those who wanted the slow, messy justice of courts, and those who wanted the quick, clean fix of a deal. I felt the old secret like a live wire under my skin. The choice was not only legal, it was moral, familial, existential. Then the lawyer opened his folder and slid a tablet across the table. The screen lit up with a video. It was short, 20 seconds grainy, handheld footage of my son in a dim room, his face flushed, his hand on a woman's shoulder. The clip ended with a shove and a muffled sound. The lawyer's finger tapped the screen. "We have this," he said. "It shows your son in a compromising situation. We have witnesses who will corroborate. If this goes public, the narrative changes." The room went cold. The bride's hand flew to her mouth. My son's face drained of color. I felt the floor tilt beneath me, as if the world had been rearranged by a single frame. "No," my son said. "That's not." "It's enough," the lawyer said. "It's enough for the press. It's enough for a smear. You can fight it, but the cost will be ruinous." Noor's jaw tightened. Where did this come from? The lawyer's smile was a thin thing. From people who have been watching. From people who want to make sure the truth is not weaponized against them. From people who prefer a settlement to a spectacle. Captain Aslam's face was unreadable. He glanced at the tablet, then at the mediator, then at us. "We will verify the footage," he said. "We will check metadata, timestamps, sources. But you must understand, in the court of public opinion, perception often outruns proof." The bride's mother stood abruptly. "This is extortion," she said. "You're trying to blackmail us." The lawyer's voice was smooth. "We are offering a path to resolution. You can accept and move on, or you can fight and risk everything." I felt something inside me fracture. The man I had protected, Farid, had returned with a pistol and a network. Now his allies had produced a video that could be used to break us. The letters, the photographs, the confession, they were fragile weapons against a machine built on influence and fear. Noor's phone buzzed. She read the message, and her face went hard. "They've uploaded the clip," she said. "It's already on a private channel. If it leaks, it will spread in an hour. Panic is a precise thing. It sharpens the edges of decisions. The bride's mother looked at my son as if measuring him for a verdict. "If you refuse," she said, voice small and fierce, "we will be dragged through the mud." My son's eyes met mine. There was a question there. No words, only the weight of choice. I thought of the nights I had swallowed shame to protect someone else. I thought of the letters my son had found, of the older person who had finally spoken, of Noor who had come to our side. I thought of the life we might lose if we accepted the deal, and the life we might lose if we refused. Then the mediator spoke, her voice a scalpel. "There is another option," she said. "We can go public with a controlled release. We can present the evidence, the letters, the witnesses, and let the investigation proceed transparently. It will be messy. It will be painful, but we'll be honest." Noor's eyes met mine. "If we go public, we need a plan," she said. "We need legal counsel, media strategy, witness protection. We need to make sure the truth is louder than the smear." The lawyer's smile thinned to a line. "You will be opening a door you cannot close," he said. "You will be inviting retaliation." The room held its breath. Outside, the rain had stopped and the city moved on, indifferent to the small, seismic choices being made in the conference room. My son stood. His voice was low, but it carried. "We go public," he said. "We tell the truth. We let the law do its work." The lawyer's eyes narrowed. "You understand the consequences?" "I do," my son said, "and I accept them." Nur exhaled, a sound that was almost a prayer. The mediator nodded, and Captain Aslam made a call. The plan began to take shape. Press releases, evidence packets, secure servers, witness statements. The room moved with a new urgency, a choreography of people who had decided to risk everything. Then my phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "We already have more." The 3 words landed like a new threat. Noor read it, and her face went still. "They're not bluffing," she said. "They have a network. They will try to drown the truth in noise." The bride's mother clutched her chest. "Who would do this?" she whispered. I looked around the table at the faces I had known my whole life. My son, fierce and raw. The bride, fragile and brave. The older person, who had finally found a voice. Noor, steady as a rock. I thought of the man in the suit, of the pistol, of the recording that had been used against me. I thought of the cousin, humiliated and furious. I thought of the city's invisible lines of power. Then Noor's phone buzzed again. She read the message, and her eyes widened. "They've posted something," she said. "It's live." We turned to the tablet on the table. The screen filled with a video feed, live, raw, merciless. It showed a social media page, comments scrolling like a tide. The clip of my son was there, but beneath it, a pinned post, a screenshot of a message thread. The sender's name was familiar in a way that made my stomach drop. It was my sister's name. The room went silent in a way that felt like a physical blow. My sister sat at the end of the table, her face pale, her hands folded so tightly her knuckles shone. She looked at me with an expression I could not read. Shame, fear, something like resolve. "No," she whispered. The mediator's eyes were sharp. "Explain," she said. My sister's voice was small, a thread. "They came to me," she said. "Years ago. They said they could help. They said if I kept quiet, they would protect us. I thought I was saving us." The betrayal landed like a fist. The letters on the table seemed to tremble. The photograph in my son's pocket felt like a relic from another life. The man I had protected had returned with a pistol and a ledger and a network that had reached into my own home. My son's face went white. The bride's hand flew to her mouth. Noor's jaw tightened. Captain Aslam's eyes were hard as flint. "You sold us," my son said, voice breaking. "You sold our truth." My sister's shoulders shook. "I didn't know it would go this far," she said. "I thought it would stop. I thought." The mediator's phone buzzed. A new notification. The video had been shared by multiple accounts. The smear was spreading like oil on water. Outside, the city moved on indifferent. Inside, our family was unraveling in real time. The choice we had made, to go public, to risk everything, had been complicated by a betrayal that cut deeper than any external threat. Nora stood, her voice low and fierce. "We proceed," she said, "but we proceed knowing the enemy is inside as well as out. We will protect witnesses. We will secure servers. We will expose the network." My sister's face crumpled. "I'm sorry," she said, and the apology was a small, useless thing in a room that had just been rearranged by treachery. The mediator closed her folder. "Then we move forward," she said. "We will go public in 1 hour. Prepare your statements." As we left the room, the rain began again, soft at first, then harder, as if the sky itself were trying to wash away what had been done. The city's lights blurred in the wet glass. My son walked beside me, his shoulders set like stone. My sister lagged behind, her steps small and uncertain. A notification pinged on my phone. A new video had been uploaded. The thumbnail showed a face I knew too well, my own, caught in a frame that made me look guilty of something I had not done. The caption read, "The man who kept secrets. The man who made deals. The man who started it all." I felt the old shame rise like bile. The room we had left felt miles away. The rain on the pavement hissed like a warning. We had chosen truth. The world had chosen war. And somewhere, in the hum of servers and the quiet of a room where deals are made, someone smiled. The courtroom smelled of paper and bleach and the kind of nervous perfume people wear when they want to be taken seriously. Cameras lined the gallery like small, patient predators. Outside, rain tapped the courthouse windows in a steady, indifferent rhythm. Inside, the air felt charged, as if the city itself had come to watch a family be remade. We had chosen to go public. We had chosen the messy, dangerous path. The smear had come fast. Clips, anonymous posts, 1,000 small knives aimed at our throats, but the truth had teeth. Nor had moved like a shadow through the press. Captain Aslam had kept the evidence airtight, and the mediator had forced the governor's office to stop pretending neutrality. The letters were authenticated. Witnesses were protected. The photograph in my son's pocket had become a key that opened more doors than we had imagined. Farid sat at the defendant's table with a composure that had once been arrogance and now looked like a practiced mask. His lawyer paced like a caged animal. The cousin, humiliated, cuffed, then released on a technicality, sat in the gallery, eyes like flint. My sister had not come to the hearing. She had sent a note that said she needed time. The older person who had finally spoken sat with a quiet dignity that made my chest ache. When the prosecutor called my name, the room seemed to tilt. I had rehearsed this moment in 1,000 private ways. How to say the truth without collapsing. How to own the past without becoming its prisoner. But rehearsals are poor substitutes for the real thing. The lights were too bright, the microphones too hungry. I stood. My legs felt like they belonged to someone else. The gallery watched. The cameras blinked. My son's hand found mine in the audience, a small, fierce anchor. "State your name for the record," the prosecutor said. I said my name. The syllables felt like stones. "Tell the court what you know about Farid Khan," the prosecutor asked. I could have told the sanitized version I had told officers. I kept a secret to protect someone. I could have said I had been afraid. I could have let the narrative be simple. But truth is not tidy. It is a tangle of motives and cowardice and love and self-preservation. The ledger I had carried for 20 years was heavier than I had admitted. "I kept him safe," I said, voice low. "But I did more than keep him safe. I helped him hide. I helped him build a life on other people's silence." The room inhaled. My son's fingers dug into mine until the pain was a white line. "You helped him?" the prosecutor repeated, not unkindly. "Explain." I told them the story I had never told aloud. The night in a hospital corridor, the bargain struck in a language of fear, the envelopes, the calls, the promises. I told them how I had convinced myself that taking the blame would save someone I loved, how I had believed that a single lie could be a shield. I told them how that shield had become a foundation for a man who learned to trade favors for power. As I spoke, the faces in the room changed. Some looked away. Some leaned forward. The older person's hand trembled on their cane. My sister's note lay folded in my son's pocket like a small, useless thing. When I finished, the silence was not empty. It was full of consequence. The prosecutor asked a few more questions: dates, names, the mechanics of the cover-up. I answered. I did not flinch. Each word felt like a small, painful unburdening. Outside, the press would call it confession. Inside, it felt like a necessary wound. The judge listened with a face that had seen too many human collapses to be surprised. Farid's lawyer sputtered, then tried to turn my admission into a bargaining chip, claiming coercion, claiming manipulation. But the truth had a momentum of its own now. Witnesses corroborated. Records matched. The cousin's empire of whispers began to look like a house of cards. The trial moved like a tide. Farid's network tried to drown us in noise. Leaks, threats, anonymous donations to sympathetic causes, but Noor had anticipated the moves. She had a way of turning optics into armor. Captain Aslam had a way of making bureaucracy into a shield. The mediator had forced transparency. The governor's office, embarrassed and exposed, retreated into a flurry of statements that read like apologies written by people who had never had to mean them. The verdict was not immediate. The legal system is a slow, grinding thing, and justice is rarely a single, clean moment. But the hearings stripped away the veneer. Farid's influence frayed. Allies who had once smiled at his table began to distance themselves. The cousin's voice, once loud and certain, became a thin echo. In the quiet between hearings, the family did what families do when the world has been rearranged. We try to pick up the pieces. Some pieces fit, some did not. My son and the bride, who had stood at the edge of life and then stepped back, found a new kind of intimacy in the rubble. They spoke in small, honest sentences. They argued. They laughed, once like a sound that had been waiting to be born. My sister came back one evening, ran in her hair, and a look of someone who had been to the bottom and found a way up. She did not ask for forgiveness. She did not expect it. She sat with me in the kitchen where the jasmine still clung to the windowsill and said, "I thought I was protecting us. I was wrong." Her apology was not a magic eraser. It was a beginning. We spoke for hours about fear, about the ways power seduces, about the small compromises that become prisons. She told me about the calls, the envelopes, the men who had smiled and then asked for more. She told me how she had thought silence was a currency she could spend to buy safety. Her voice broke when she said, "I didn't know how to stop." We did not fix everything. Some relatives left and did not return. Some friendships were severed. The aunt who had kept score moved away. The cousin's name became a cautionary tale. But other things shifted. The older person who had been silenced found a voice that did not tremble. They began to speak at community meetings, at small gatherings, telling the truth in a way that made it harder for predators to hide. My son and his bride married months later in a small ceremony. No chandeliers, no cameras, just a handful of people who had chosen to stay. The legal outcome was a slow, partial victory. Farid was convicted on charges that could not be bought away: assault, coercion, conspiracy. He received a sentence that would keep him from the city's corridors of power for years. The cousin faced charges too. His empire of whispers crumbled under the weight of corroborated testimony. The governor's office issued statements and then moved on, as institutions do. The man in the suit, Farid's face in a different light, sat in a cell and had time to think about the architecture of his life. But the final twist, the one that made the whole thing feel like a story with a moral, was not in the courtroom. It was in the small, ordinary moments that followed. I had confessed. I had named my complicity. I had paid a price that was not only legal, but moral. The twist was this: by admitting my guilt, by refusing to let the lie stand, I freed my son from the inheritance of shame. He no longer had to carry a story that was not his. He could build a life that was not defined by my choices. There was a cost. There always is. Some doors closed forever. Some apologies arrived too late. But the life lesson that settled over us like a slow dawn was simple and brutal. Silence can be a shelter, but it can also be a cell. Protecting someone by hiding the truth can make you complicit in their crimes. Courage is not only in exposing others, it is in exposing yourself. On the day the judge read the sentence, the rain had stopped and the sky was a clean, hard blue. My son stood beside me in the courtroom doorway, his hand on my shoulder. He did not look triumphant. He looked tired and steady, like someone who had been through a storm and found shore. As we walked out into the light, cameras flashing, people shouting, a woman in the crowd called out, "What now?" Her voice was small and curious. My son looked at me, then at the woman, then at the courthouse steps that had felt like a mountain. He smiled, a small, honest thing, and said, "We tell the truth. We keep telling it." I thought of the years I had spent hiding, of the ledger I had carried, of the night my son asked me not to come. I thought of the box of letters, of Noor's steady hand, of Captain Oslam's tired eyes. I thought of the older person who had finally spoken and of my sister who had come back. The final line of the story was not a neat moral or a tidy closure. It was a weathered truth that settled into my bones like a new habit. And that was the moment I learned that some debts must be paid in full, and some apologies arrived too late. But the only way to stop a lie from becoming a life is to speak the truth, even when it costs everything.